The Crucible of Modern Thought by William Walker Atkinson. Chapter 1. The Modern Reconfiguration of Intellectual Currents. Any individual who has remained cognizant of the currents of contemporary intellectual trends must inevitably be aware of the operation of the potent processes of deconstruction, edification, realignment, and reconstitution currently transpiring within the realm of thought, indeed, in every region of that domain. It may be aptly posited that modern thought resides within the melting pot, and that even the most meticulous observers remain in ignorance regarding what shall ultimately emerge from that vessel. Preeminent intellectuals across all disciplines of human knowledge have cast their conceptions into the great crucible of 20th-century thought, there to commingle with the ideas of others and to be fused into some marvelous new amalgamation, the precise nature of which lies beyond the comprehension of even the most prescient thinker among us. Naturally, each contributor or class of contributors to the aggregate of material deposited within the great melting pot remains convinced that his or her specific contribution must necessarily constitute the predominant element in the new composition, and that their particular theory will appear conspicuously evident in the resulting synthesis. However, the thinker who maintains a detached stance, who assumes a judicial frame of mind, and who surveys the process from a viewpoint affording the proper perspective, possesses no such certainty regarding the final outcome. He perceives the general trajectory of the intellectual currents, yet he also recognizes the operation of reaction succeeding action and the interplay of the opposing poles of thought. Thus, he reserves his final judgment regarding the outcome and waits with patience. The answer resides in the future. The present serves merely as the theater of the struggle and effervescence. The ingredients of the new composition are being cast into the vast vessel, one by one, with each day adding new materials that will operate in determining the nature of the composite substance to be poured forth eventually, which will subsequently undergo the slow process of cooling and crystallization. Yet he is either an imprudent man, an audacious man, or an inspired prophet who presumes to venture a prediction regarding the precise nature of that which shall emerge from the crucible when all this heterogeneous mass of raw material shall have been melted, fused, and amalgamated. One seeking the causes of this modern unrest in the world of thought must retreat far back into the pages of philosophy in his pursuit. For much of the modern activity stems from causes latent in the thought of hundreds, nay thousands, of years past. There has existed a constant evolution of thought, characterized by its action and reaction, its manifestation of the opposing poles of activity, its tides and currents, and its regression and subsequent reclamation of lost ground. In this evolution, one has observed the constant oscillation of the pendulum of thought from one extreme to another and back again, that curious manifestation of fashion in thought which causes a favored set of ideas to flourish for a time and then sink into obscurity, there to remain for centuries, only to resurge with renewed vigor after the passage of years. Strange as it may appear to many, nearly all of the great modern philosophical truths have been known in the past and have endured this period of obscurity and concealment, only now to emerge upon the scene of modern thought in full vigor, asserting their rightful place in the evolution of thought. It must be conceded, however, that the modern scientific spirit, that spirit which seeks truth for the sake of truth, and which follows reason wheresoever it may lead, irrespective of the personal beliefs, theories, and opinions of the investigators, appears to be unique and distinctive to this age. Never before in the history of human thought has there been manifested such a sincere desire for the veritable truth as exists at present. We observe thinkers and investigators sorrowfully, yet willingly, relinquishing many of their old and hallowed ideas and beliefs, because investigation has demonstrated the irrationality of such convictions. The disposition of the materialists, who, in their search for evidence that matter was the final and ultimate reality, discovered instead that matter, in the archaic sense, dissolved into mystery and became non-existent, and who subsequently accepted the new knowledge with alacrity, stands as but one evidence of the modern scientific spirit animating the world's premier thinkers. The courage and honesty of many thinkers along theological lines, who find it necessary to jettison their antiquated dogmas as the price for the discovery of higher conceptions of truth, is akin to the instance just cited, and indeed requires even greater fortitude and integrity of purpose. While this unrest in the world of thought appears to be dispersed across a vast and varied field, if we but closely scrutinize the underlying causes, we shall perceive that all these varied manifestations and phases of unrest truly arise from the shifting foundations of popular philosophy. And, indeed, the fundamental concept upon which philosophy rests is involved in this displacement and readjustment. That basic concept is that which humanity terms the idea of fundamental principles, and which underlies all philosophic thought, just as foundation stones underlie every edifice. A shifting of that foundation precipitates the collapse of the structure, or at least disturbs its equilibrium, fractures its walls, and necessitates radical and significant repairs. And this is precisely what has transpired in the world of thought today. The conceptions regarding fundamental principles are undergoing alteration, and the structure of thought erected thereupon is imperiled. Its walls are fracturing, its beams shifting, its floors sagging, and its roof stands awry. Precisely the magnitude of the damage and the extent of the repairs required can be determined only by time, for the shifting and displacement of the foundation remain in progress. Some speculate that it will be necessary to demolish the walls and erect an entirely new edifice upon the readjusted foundation. But who can say? This assertion that the conception of fundamental principles is being disturbed, and is thus engendering the distress within the edifice of modern thought, may appear peculiar to those who have surmised that the discoveries in physical science and the unrest in sociological thought constituted the disturbing elements. Yet the meticulous thinker will perceive that the actual disturbance resides far deeper than these. For these conceptions rely substantially, at least in their application and elaboration, upon the world's conception of the fundamental principles supporting the phenomenal universe. All edifices of thought must be constructed upon some foundation, and the only veritable foundation for thought is the conception of the fundamental principles, upon which the particular conceptions of philosophy, nature, and life erected thereupon are contingent. Ultimately, all physical conceptions must repose upon the basis of some metaphysical conception. This may not be apparent upon initial consideration, but a retracing of the steps of reasoning will demonstrate that the statement is correct. The parable of the house built upon shifting sand, and that built upon solid rock, is congruent with the facts of thought and philosophy. It occasionally occurs, however, that what has been perceived as a foundation of solid rock is finally discovered to be merely friable sandstone, which is rapidly disintegrating into shifting sand. And this appears to be the predicament today. The foundation is apparently eroding, or at least settling into a new adjustment of itself. And this settling or eroding process is disrupting thought and life in all of its manifold phases. Let us now investigate the case of this shifting or eroding foundation. Let us ascertain, if possible, the nature and extent of the damage. In order to proceed intelligently, we must, for the time being, set aside our prejudices and maintain an open mind. Let us examine what men are articulating and contemplating regarding the matter, and subsequently proceed to formulate our conclusions regarding the true state of affairs. This constitutes the objective of this volume, and this alone. I shall not attempt to proselytize any individual to my specific perspectives regarding this subject. Indeed, I shall endeavor to maintain my personal views in the background. Rather than appearing as counsel for the prosecution or the defense, I shall attempt to occupy the judicial bench. Rather than advancing the arguments of counsel for either faction, I shall endeavor to pursue the judicial course of summarizing and reviewing the evidence, subsequently submitting said evidence to the jury constituted by the readers of this volume. This comprises the sole equitable method, and I trust that you, the jury, will accord me credit for impartiality and just intent as we advance. The concept of fundamental principles is contingent upon the notion of an underlying entity, within which philosophy maintains that all existence must live, move, and possess its being. The human intellect has perpetually inclined toward the conception of a something underpinning all individual manifestations of existence, the ocean of being, wherein all specific entities are merely as droplets or particles. This universal principle of existence has been variously conceptualized as possessing a nature ranging from pure spirit to pure matter. Theologians have envisioned it as a mysterious entity termed spirit, connected in some manner with deity. Philosophers have endeavored to ascribe to it sundry and diverse natures. Modern science has regarded it either as the principle of matter, on the one hand, or as that infinite and eternal energy from which all things proceed, as Spencer articulated, on the other. Ancient Oriental metaphysicians, alongside modern idealism, have deemed it pure mind. Ancient pantheism and modern transcendentalism have regarded being as identical to deity. Between these variegated conceptions, the metaphysical and philosophical conflict has raged. While, initially, it may appear that the conflict concerns only theologians, philosophers, and metaphysicians, a more rigorous examination will reveal that its influence and scope extend far beyond these bounds, inasmuch as our conceptions of life, action, duty, morals, and general conduct must, and do, depend materially upon the conception of being retained by the popular mind. The individual may remain uncertain or indifferent, yet he is nonetheless affected and, to a certain extent, bound by the ideas arising from such popular conceptions. The affairs of human lives depend upon certain standards, and these standards rely upon the popular conception regarding the source of said standards, as well as the belief in and acceptance of the authority of the standard makers. These standards may be said to possess the efficacy of laws, and the validity of all laws must rest upon the acceptance by the populace of the authority, reality, and power of the lawmaker to enforce them. Therefore, any disturbance regarding the validity of life standards and values must arise from a shifting conception regarding the fundamental source of these standards, values, and laws within the public consciousness. And this is precisely what is meant when we assert that the foundation of the structure of thought and action exhibits signs of shifting, settling, or sinking. This foundation resides naturally within the public mind, and we must look to the public mind for evidence of the transformations currently underway. Remember, first and last, that I am not attempting to adjudicate the truth or untruth of any particular conceptions of fundamental truths, nor am I undertaking to theorize or speculate upon the actual nature of truth. We are merely conducting an investigation into the state of the public mind regarding the subject, merely taking the pulse of modern thought. Upon the fundamental conceptions within the public mind depend the actions and lives of the individuals composing that public. Not only is it true that a tree is known by its fruits, but it is equally true that the fruits may be known by their tree. We may infer popular standards by observing the actions of the populace. Conversely, we may predict the actions of the populace by understanding the public standards. And the standards must ultimately depend upon the accepted idea or conception of fundamental principles. Investigate the subject from any point of origin, and we find ourselves approaching the center at last. In considering the conception of fundamental principles and its effect on the creation of standards of living and action, we need not regress further than the Middle Ages. That particular period of human history demonstrates, in itself, a reactionary swing of the pendulum of thought. Independent thought had reached its lowest ebb. Here and there, one might encounter a thinker who dared to employ his reason, yet the philosophies of antiquity were forgotten or unknown to the masses, and dogmatic theology had cast its stifling pall over the embers of independent thought so thoroughly as to nearly smother out of existence even its feeble spark. There was no question regarding fundamental principles disturbing the public mind of the Middle Ages. Every matter of this nature had been positively and thoroughly settled by the Church. The world had been created ex nihilo, in 6 days, some 5,000 years prior to that era. The animals had been fashioned, one by one, species by species, and man was a special creation, arriving after the entire earth had been prepared for him. He had partaken of the forbidden fruit and had been expelled from Eden, and the curse of original sin had been placed upon the race. There were no disputed questions of geology, anthropology, or general science. The earth was flat, and the sun and stars revolved around it. This relieved the minds of the populace of all burdensome questions of astronomy, and the nebular hypothesis remained undreamed of. Ethics and morality were likewise beyond dispute or argument. These matters had been settled definitively by the Scriptures, interpreted by the infallible authority of the Church. Theologians disputed doctrinal points, yet this did not concern the general public, for the latter knew nothing of these subjects. The authority was supreme, the standards were firmly established, and there was nothing to contemplate. Some failed to adhere to the standards, yet the standards remained fixed notwithstanding. Time progressed, printing was discovered, and the populace began to peruse books. Then ensued the theological revolts, which resulted in the establishment of various churches in opposition to the singular church. People began to realize that it was possible and permissible to reason regarding matters, rather than being compelled to accept them upon mere authority. The Reformation, as it is designated, was the entering wedge of independent thought. People actually dared to question the authority of the Church, and, wonder of wonders, they were not struck dead on the spot. The chains were loosened, and the primal causes of the present unrest were set in motion. As time passed, the churches disputed one with another, and various sects and divisions arose, each of which based its schism upon some disputed conception of doctrine or practice. Subsequently, the members of the various sects began to hold individual opinions, although they still adhered to general truths and creeds. Creeds became broader, and men claimed a greater and ever-increasing right to individual interpretation and freer thought. Although the educated classes performed the majority of the thinking, still, as is always the case, their opinions gradually filtered through to the lower classes and changes became general. During the 18th century, there was significant activity in Europe along the lines of free thought. All manner of heretical schools became popular, ranging from atheism to modified deism. The populace also began to rebel against the constituted authorities. The doctrine of divine right began to be doubted. The French Revolution was an active factor in the shaking off of old ideals, both political and theological. And although a reaction set in following the terrible excesses of the fanatics of the times, the work had nonetheless been accomplished, and much of the leaven remained. The American Revolution, distinguished by its democratic precepts and the heterodox perspectives of figures such as Jefferson and Paine, augmented the labors accomplished by the earlier progenitors of the French Revolution, as well as the doctrines of Voltaire and his intellectual school. Throughout the 19th century, the advancements of physical science made yet further encroachments upon the orthodox teachings of antiquity. Upon attaining the century's meridian, luminaries such as Darwin, Huxley, Tyndall, and Herbert Spencer commenced to exercise a formidable influence upon the popular consciousness. Consequently, orthodoxy was placed unequivocally on the defensive in a manner hitherto unobserved, a state of affairs that persists to the present era, with the orthodox echelons having been compelled to execute a steady withdrawal, to the extent that numerous contemporary orthodox tenets appear nearly as heterodox as the skeptical postulations of 50 or 100 years prior. Many of the orthodox pulpits of the present day articulate perspectives nearly identical to those which scandalized our great-grandfathers when originally promulgated by Thomas Paine. The higher criticism of the current age extends beyond the boundaries of the infidelism prevalent in 1850. The theory of evolution and the descent of man dismantled many of the ancient impediments, while the treatises of Huxley and Spencer demolished yet more. It became fashionable to identify as an evolutionist, whereas the adherents of the archaic doctrines were deemed anachronistic. A potent propensity toward materialism emerged, which many conjectured was destined to obliterate the entire antiquated line of orthodox defenses. Yet, remarkably, toward the conclusion of the century, a reaction commenced. Although the populace had been captivated by the novel teachings that had effaced the former modes of thought, the primordial religious instinct and the yearning for spiritual matters had not been annihilated. Possessing invigorated strength due to their temporary suppression, these elements within the human psyche impelled the pendulum of thought away from materialism. Materialism, once so prevalent within scientific circles and universities, has now almost entirely vanished, having been superseded by a fresh conception of idealism. There remains, naturally, an old guard of materialism, yet its popularity has departed for the interim. However, the pendulum, in its retrograde oscillation, did not transport popular thought back to the former orthodox standards. These appeared to have been discarded definitively. There existed a necessity for a novel set of conceptions, and this demand generated the requisite supply. Herein we possess the key to the present state of affairs. Occupying the vacuum created by the evaporation of the older orthodox dogmas, we discover the ideals of ancient Greek philosophy mingling with the yet more ancient teachings of the Hindus, and pervading all is the resonant note of mysticism which has ever permeated human thought across every religion, every epoch, and every race. The discarded and long reviled teachings of the Gnostics, that core of early Christian mystics, have resurrected and, under new appellations, have found popular favor within the public mind of the 20th century. The doctrines of the ancient Hindu Vedantism, granted renewed impetus by Emerson and the Transcendentalists, occupy a prominent position in the advancing thought of today. Plato has surged into renewed and startling popular favor, and many advanced modern thinkers discover within his pages the truths for which they have sought in vain elsewhere. Heraclitus finds corroboration in the tenets of modern science, and his perspectives on eternal change and the becoming of the universe are reiterated in numerous modern doctrines. Other fragments of philosophy have been appropriated from Buddhism, and even from the Sufis, the mystic sect of Mohammedanism. Even the philosophy of Lao Tzu, the ancient Chinese sage who expounded upon the Tao or Way, is accepted as accurately representing certain stages of modern thought. The new vessels of the present are being replenished with the vintage wine of the past. Chapter 2. The Revival of Ancient Idealistic Pantheism. The intellectual tenor of the 20th century has drawn audaciously upon past centuries for its reservoirs of wisdom and philosophy, and has appropriated the same with temerity, frequently omitting the requisite attribution. Novel sects, schools, and cults have emerged, each exercising a distinct influence upon the prevailing thought of the era. Theosophy has functioned as a leaven toward popularizing Hindu conceptions, particularly regarding the doctrines of reincarnation and rebirth. Christian Science has exerted an influence toward idealism, evoking in certain respects, independent of its therapeutic tenets, the idealistic teachings of the Vedanta and the Grecian philosophers. Unitarianism has wielded a potent influence among the churches, and its effects are discernible even within the pulpits that revile it. The higher criticism within the churches has tended to shepherd the public away from the antiquated ideas to which they were once wedded. In the great metropolises, references from the pulpit regarding eternal punishment, hellfire, or a personal devil evoke merely smiles and shrugs. To an impartial observer, it would appear that many of the archaic teachings have been abandoned, never to return. Yet who can ascertain the truth after all? Even their turn may eventually recur. 25 years prior, an astute observer of the times would have felt entirely secure in predicting that, from the seething cauldron of that day, there must emerge the new teachings of materialism, which at that juncture seemed destined to prevail. But alas for human prescience, the precise inverse has transpired. Materialism has been dismissed for the interim, and wonder upon wonders, advanced idealism has assumed the center of the field of human philosophical thought. Indeed, not merely advanced idealism, but even a rarefied pantheism under alternative appellations. The predictions of 25 years ago have proven erroneous, and the tables have been turned upon the prophets of that era. Materialism has been eliminated, and its direct antithesis, idealistic pantheism, has been accorded the seat of honor. This is not the crude materialistic pantheism which insists that deity is but the aggregate of natural objects and forces, but rather the spiritual phase of pantheism which insists that deity is manifested in all natural things, the doctrine of the immanent spirit. And this persists even in its most idealistic sense, for the vanguard of modern philosophical thought certainly adheres to the notion that the universe is in reality an idea, or a series of ideas within the universal mind. The most radical branch of the great Vedanta school of the Hindus, the Advaitists, have never dared to proceed further in this direction than the most advanced adherents of 20th century idealism, which is presently exerting so potent an influence upon public thought. Some who have not as yet dared to proceed to the full extent of this extreme idealism do not hesitate to teach and preach the complete doctrine of the immanent deity, which they maintain is also taught by the biblical instructor who stated that in him we live and move and have our being. This is surely a most radical departure from the antiquated teaching of the deity who ever dwelt apart from his creation, and who fashioned the universe from nothingness. And surely, the standard constructed upon this new teaching must differ materially from those erected upon the old. It is this marked shifting of the foundational conception of fundamental principles that has disturbed the edifice of thought, life, and action today. Have we discarded the solid rock for the sinking sand, or vice versa? Each individual must answer according to his own views and conceptions. The newer school claims that it has discovered solid rock at last, while the older school insists that its opponents are blasting at the rock of ages. Which is correct, and what shall the harvest be? Time alone can answer. Each must be judged by its works. By their fruits shall ye know them. And time is requisite for the fruits and works of the new. Perhaps from the old and the new, a still newer entity may arise, superior and nobler than either. Time must answer. Like the Sphinx, time crouches upon her haunches, and with pensive, undisturbed eyes gazes out into the eternity of the future. What does she perceive there? What does she perceive? Ah, if we could only ascertain. To those who may imagine that I have placed too much emphasis upon the popularity of the conceptions of the immanent deity, or the oneness of all, which is a distinctive feature of the newer thought of the day, I refer to the news columns of the journals of any large city in the land, containing the reports of the sermons delivered in the leading pulpits. Let them refer to the utterances of the prominent theological instructors of the day. Let them refer to the teachings of the following representative figures of the great universities of the land, as reported in the daily press and periodicals of the day. Surely these recount the narrative in no uncertain tones. Harold Balche, in a recent article in the Cosmopolitan magazine entitled Avatars of the Almighty, provides a number of instances in which college professors are teaching this new conception of fundamental principles, the conception of the indwelling deity of the immanent God. In conclusion, he states, "And now that man has discovered that there resides in his nature a spirit or energy that is divine, the colleges say, and that he can summon it to work his will, the potency and future operation of this psychic force no man can compute. Science has found a way through psychology to God. The opportunities for the race, through invoking in the human consciousness the brooding spirit that fills all space, are absolutely infinite. Science, therefore, is demonstrating along new lines, or at least is claiming to demonstrate, that man is God made manifest. And modern philosophy, as set forth in American universities, holds this incarnation not as a fanciful and merely beautiful ideal, but as a working and understandable principle in the soul of humanity. The professors, therefore, who are digging what they believe to be the graves for dead dogmas, stand as exponents of the teaching that man is the embodiment and conscious expression of the force that guides all life and holds all matter in its course. Man has begun the cycle of that triumphal daring prophesied by ancient seers, and which appealed so potently to the imagination of Poe. Not merely in religious rhetoric, but in reality, the schoolmen say, "Is man the avatar of God?" The reference to Poe is accompanied by the following quotation from that poet. Think that the sense of individual identity will be gradually merged in the general consciousness. That man, for example, ceasing imperceptibly to feel himself man, will at length attain that awfully triumphant epoch, when he shall recognize his existence as that of Jehovah. The editor of the Cosmopolitan, in commenting upon the article in question, states, "The college professors, in some cases, express doubt as to the practicability and judgment of their teachings. Will their propaganda cause a rejection of all solemn and religious authority, create a Robespierre, and erect a guillotine, with its concomitant tumbrils and blood atonement?" The professors say no. They assert that in this, the sanest of all ages, man thinks for himself, and the path they blaze for him leads to the realization that he himself is an avatar and incarnation of God. The conflict between the colleges and the church discloses a movement of thought more significant, perhaps, to civilization than even the Renaissance. In its revolutionary character, and in its importance to mankind, the only worldwide movement that can be compared with it was that upheaval in the 18th century which led, through bloodshed, to democracy. The claim of the colleges is that they are teaching a higher form of truth. They hold that the Orthodox God has had his day. They say that when the God of theology is utterly banished from human thought, the reign of man will begin. It is asserted, as previously indicated, that this spiritual revolution shall not culminate in a saturnalia of tumbrils and guillotines. For this is not an atheistic expulsion of God and his holy angels, but rather the enthronement of a new Jehovah, a deity who has become conscious and potent within the human mind. Beyond the confines of pulpits and universities, other influences are operative. Primarily, one perceives the profound impact of that immense wave of transcendental thought which swept across the nation during the preceding century, of which Emerson was the principal exponent. The consequence of Emerson's transcendentalism is most distinct within the current unrest regarding thought and conception. His oversoul constitutes the foundation of a mystical religion that has afforded comfort and peace to many a weary spirit. The very essence of his pedagogy is, naturally, the oneness of all and the indwelling spirit. The influence of Walt Whitman, Edward Carpenter, and Browning has been palpably felt in the general momentum toward the transcendental conception. Maeterlinck has likewise directed the attention and interest of many toward identical or analogous concepts. Individuals who have scrutinized the German philosophers, particularly Hegel and Schopenhauer, frequently discover themselves drawn toward the doctrines and conceptions of the present stage of idealism. The influence of the Congress of Religions during the era of the World's Fair in Chicago has induced the populace to cultivate a renewed interest in the study of comparative religion, particularly regarding the faiths of the Orient, nearly all of which are predicated upon some form of pantheistic or idealistic doctrine. The effect of Christian Science and the various New Thought cults and schools has been to guide human intellect in the same general direction, toward the recognition, realization, and manifestation of the God within. Indeed, it would appear as though 1,000 circumstances had conspired to propel modern thought to a juncture wherein it must contemplate the new idealism and the fresh presentation of the immanent and indwelling spirit. The world appears to have turned its back upon orthodoxy, yet simultaneously has refused to entertain or accept the tenets of materialism, notwithstanding the predictions of the thinkers of the last century. It requires something to occupy the void left by the old ideas, which are currently being discarded, and the concept of the indwelling spirit, the oneness of all, the union with God, appears to be the logical conception under all prevailing circumstances. At the present time, there is undeniably a wave converging from all directions, tending ever towards centering the world's thought upon the old-new conception of fundamental principles. Whether it is permanent, or whether it shall vanish in a reactionary movement, or whether it shall evolve into something yet higher and nearer to truth, these are the questions that observant men ask one another today. It is indeed a sagacious individual who can answer them. And now to address the immediate effects of this alteration in conceptions regarding fundamental principles. What effect is it producing upon the populace of today? What is its influence upon other avenues of thought? What effect is it exerting upon the great economic, sociological, ethical, and moral movements of the day. How is the new conception manifesting in actual practice? These are significant questions. Let us consider them. From the viewpoint of the unchanged, steadfast members of the old guard of orthodoxy, the new conceptions are pernicious in their effect and can effectuate naught but harm to the race. In the first place, these good people assert, there is nothing novel about the matter. It is as ancient as the race itself. This is undoubtedly true, for the same teachings, beliefs, and conceptions which are now so popular may be discovered in the oldest of the world's philosophies and religions. India and ancient Greece serve as the fountainhead for the basic ideas of modern popular conceptions. In the Vedanta, in the teachings of Buddha, and in the writings of Plato, Heraclitus, Democritus, and the Stoic philosophers, one may locate the principles of the popular thought of today. The cycle or spiral of human thought has brought the old philosophies to the fore as if they were new. Yet, is the fact that an ostensibly new thing is genuinely old any valid argument against it? Secondly, these critics state it originates from heathen sources. This is also true, yet it constitutes circular reasoning. The fact that an ancient philosopher, existing before the era of Christianity, happened to fail to be a Christian is no argument against his truths. Nor are all truth, wisdom, and virtue the exclusive property of Christian thinkers. If we were to discard all heathen knowledge, the world would be a severe loser. Thirdly, the critics claim it is naught but pantheism. This may be so, but, notwithstanding the odium attached to the term by the Orthodox churchmen, pantheism has inspired some of the world's greatest minds. There exist two forms of pantheism, the first being that of the materialists, who maintain that God is merely the sum and substance of natural forces and objects. The second being the view of the God-drunken philosopher Spinoza, who held that God was in all and all in God, that nature and the universe were but a manifestation of God, and that to define God is to deny him. To comprehend the charge of pantheism hurled at the old new conception of the oneness of all by orthodox critics, one must realize what the pantheism of Spinoza entails, and recognize how distinct it is from the old pantheism of the materialists. The following quotation from the Encyclopedic Dictionary states the matter briefly and clearly. The system of Spinoza has been described as atheism, as pantheism, and as the most rigid monotheism, according as his cardinal teaching, that there is but one substance, God, has been interpreted. By substance, however, Spinoza meant the underlying reality and ever-living existence, and he chose for the epigraph of his ethics the words of St. Paul. In him we live, and move, and have our being, Acts 17 verse 28. God is for him the one principle, possessing thought and extension as two eternal and infinite attributes constituting his essence, of which attributes mind and matter are the necessary manifestations. Thus, he solves the problem of the relation of the finite to the infinite. Everything is a form of the ever-living existence, the substance, God, which is and is not nature, with which he is no more to be confounded than the fountain with the rivulet or eternity with time. God is natura naturans, nature is natura naturata. The one is the energy, the other the act. In the same manner, he explains the union of the soul with the body. Man is but a mode of the divine existence. His mind is a spark of the divine flame, his body a mode of the infinite existence. Surely this approaches very near to agreement with the 20th century conception of the omnipresent spirit. If one is pantheism, the other must be also. We leave this subject in the hands of the respective schools. Fourthly, the orthodox critics assert, when we deny the personality of God, We deny his being as God and resolve him into a mere principle, the principle of nature. This is another matter which may be safely left for the consideration of theologians. It is too technical for discussion herein. We must, however, mention the view of Schopenhauer, who taught the idea of a world spirit, which he called the will to live. He stated, "When we assert pantheism, we deny the existence of a God. When we identify God with nature, we really show God to the door." The contention of the orthodox, that all the attributes, qualities, and characteristics which orthodoxy ascribes to the personal God disappear when the personality is denied, appears worthy of respectful consideration. And the new conceptions certainly do emphatically deny the personality of God, and certainly do regard him as a principle. Therefore, we may understand the cry of orthodoxy, that they would take away Jehovah and supplant him by a shadowy principle. Yet, a university professor has articulated this sentiment. The theological perspective that perceives God as external to the human self is a view that dominates only the most rudimentary forms of religion. Precisely to what extent the traditional qualities, characteristics, and attributes of a personal deity may be preserved when the personal conception is supplanted by an abstract principle, which, by its very nature, must be absolute and devoid of such specific traits, remains a question for philosophers to debate amongst themselves. We do not venture an opinion. We serve merely as the chronicler of ideas observed within the public consciousness. However, the orthodox critics ultimately exclaim, if one denies the personal God, the inspiration of the Scriptures, and the authority of the Church, one obliterates the very standards of religion, morality, and the laws governing human conduct. One is left with only a recourse to utilitarian ethics and moral systems constructed upon the mutable ideals of man, or upon his purported necessities. Your standards fluctuate with the era. You destroy all established norms, and the bedrock crumbles beneath your feet. We consider this objection to merit serious contemplation. It inevitably follows that if the authority of the Scriptures and the Church is denied, then the standards resting upon this authority must likewise collapse, and man must be compelled to construct standards based upon his own reason, judgment, and experience, rather than upon ecclesiastical or scriptural authority. It is herein that many meticulous observers discern the immediate cause of much of the sociological, economic, and ethical unrest, as well as the shifting standards of the present day. These observers posit that the human race, now in the process of discarding ancient authority, must inherently lose faith in the infallibility of the old standards. It is beginning to formulate new criteria based upon the needs, real or supposed, of humanity, and this occasions much of the turmoil and ebullition within the great melting pot of modern thought. Individuals are inquiring why they should remain bound to archaic forms when the authority underwriting those forms has been discarded. They ask why they should attempt to adhere to the old admonitions. Why must one submit to all governors, teachers, spiritual pastors, and masters, order oneself lowly and reverently to all betters, or do one's duty in that state of life into which it shall please God to call one, when the authority of the Church which so enjoined these duties is now in grave doubt? They query, if the 10 Commandments are denied as inspired, then what commandments shall we follow? If the Scriptures are not inspired, what constitutes the true rule of conduct and life? These are the interrogatives that the common populace is raising. They exist within a transitional stage. In many instances, they are revolting against the old rules of social life, economics, and traditional morality. They are disputing many venerable ideas regarding property, social duties, the relationship between state and citizen, marriage, inter alia. With the barriers dismantled, they contemplate building according to their own desires or requirements, rather than relying upon the dicta of churchmen and ancient prophets. All these elements are fermenting within the crucible, driven by the changing conceptions of fundamental principles. On the other hand, the advocate of the new conceptions responds that, while this is entirely true, and while the old standards are indeed being destroyed and discarded, man is simultaneously engaged in constructing for the race a newer, saner, and grander edifice of thought. They argue for a better, truer, and stronger set of standards based upon human needs, experience, and requirements. They posit that, instead of following the arbitrary commands of deceased prophets and teachers, or of antiquated and discarded creeds, the race shall advance, inspired by the indwelling Spirit of God made manifest as man, ever toward higher and nobler efforts, toward superior states of being, following always the idea embodied in the verses of Holmes. Build thee more stately mansions, O my soul, as the swift seasons roll, leave thy low-vaulted past, let each new temple, nobler than the last, shut thee from heaven with a dome more vast, till thou at length art free, leaving thine outgrown shell by life's unresting sea. And in the interim, for those of us who may feel disoriented by this process of demolition and reconstruction, who feel the pang of relinquishing the old, and the perplexity resulting from the attempt to adapt to the new, we who, though our faces and intellects are turned toward the future, still feel that our hearts reside with the past, what recourse remains but to proceed in our search with a positive faith, knowing that a constant and persistent desire for truth must inevitably conduct us into the very light of truth? Thus, it has transpired that in the consideration of conflicting ideas, theories, and conceptions presenting themselves at the bar of modern thought, a new school is now making its claims heard. A school which many believe is destined to occupy a prominent position in the theater of interest in the near future. This school holds as its fundamental tenet the notion that abstract truth is unknowable. It asserts that the human mind is unable to grasp the concept of abstract principle any more than it can grasp that of abstract air, abstract water, or abstract stone. It maintains that man does not and cannot know whence he comes, whither he goes, or what constitutes the objective of his existence. It suggests, therefore, that his highest wisdom lies in acknowledging this reality and subsequently living in the present, accepting whatever good may come to hand, and discarding all inquiries incapable of a definitive answer. He acts with kindness and benevolence wherever possible, not as a duty, but because of the evolving sense of the brotherhood of man, and finally tests all statements of truth by the touchstone of utility, forever posing the questions: what is its purpose? How will it function? To what use can it be put? Does it prove efficacious? This class of thinkers demonstrates a preference for the pragmatic view of thought and life, which Professor James has so eloquently articulated as the attitude of looking away from first things, principles, categories, supposed necessities, and of looking toward last things, fruits, consequences, facts. After all, would it not be remarkable if the pragmatic method should prove to be the solution, the ultimate criterion to be applied to the products of the crucible? Would it not be the final test of how does it resolve? What is its utility? What benefit will it confer upon the race? To what extent does it prove valid? Meanwhile, the cauldron bubbles, seethes, and sputters. The crucible is heated to its utmost intensity. Some of the thoughts and ideas deposited therein we recognize as true. Concerning others, there exists grave doubt. Yet, what shall be the new configuration, the new system, the new application? In brief, what shall be poured forth from the vessel? The world stands at rapt attention, watching, wondering. Chapter 3. The historical impact of New England Transcendentalism. As an additional indication demonstrating the direction in which the philosophical current is flowing during this era of intellectual disquiet, and as a substantiation of the assertions articulated in the preceding chapters of this volume, I invite the reader to contemplate the following citations from the most recent work of Professor William James of Harvard University, which is founded upon a series of lectures concerning the philosophical situation of the present day. It must be noted, however, that these citations do not necessarily constitute a representation of Professor James's personal convictions or tenets, but are merely expressions of his observations regarding the prevailing spirit of modern philosophical thought within universities and among individuals of advanced education. Professor James states, "Those among us who have attained the status of sexagenarians have personally observed one of those progressive mutations of the intellectual climate, attributable to innumerable influences, which render the thought of a past generation as foreign to its successor as though it were the expression of a distinct race of men. The theological apparatus that spoke so vibrantly to our ancestors, with its finite age of the world, its creation ex nihilo, its judicial morality and eschatology, its relish for rewards and retributions, and its characterization of God as an external contriver, an intelligent and moral governor, appears as incongruous to the majority of us as if it were some barbaric and alien creed." Professor James subsequently proceeds to discuss the spirit of modern philosophical thought in the universities as follows. Dualistic theism is professed at all Catholic seats of learning, whereas it has in recent years tended to diminish markedly at our British and American universities, being replaced by a monistic pantheism that is more or less disguised. I harbor the impression that ever since the era of T.H. Green, absolute idealism has been decidedly in the ascendant at Oxford. It is similarly in the ascendant at my own University of Harvard. Furthermore, our contemporary mind having definitively apprehended the possibility of a more intimate Weltanschauung, the only opinion sufficiently worthy of arresting our attention will fall within the general scope of what may be roughly designated as the pantheistic field of vision, the vision of God as the indwelling divine rather than the external creator, and of human life as an integral component of that profound reality. In the present chapter, it is my intention to consider one of the most proximate and potent of the innumerable influences to which is due this present gradual mutation of the intellectual climate, which renders the thought of a past generation seem as foreign to its successor as if it were the expression of a different race of men, as Professor James has so eloquently stated. This direct and immediate influence of which I speak, which has contributed so significantly to the effervescence of the crucible of modern thought, is the influence of the transcendental movement of New England from 1830 to 1850, and the influence of Emerson in particular. I maintain with conviction that the present condition of spiritual unrest and the prevalence of monistic idealism, while possessing an original source far removed in the past history of thought, nevertheless reached us through the direct channel of the great transcendental movement in New England during the first half of the last century, and largely through the individual channel of expression of Ralph Waldo Emerson. The devotees and admirers of Emerson have long claimed this, and the opponents of the movement are now commencing to recognize it. As one disaffected Orthodox speaker recently remarked, Emerson is the individual who lies at the root of this entire disturbance. His pantheistic teachings are now bearing fruit. The origins of the transcendental movement in New England may be discerned in the remarkable interest manifested by educated New Englanders, during the first 25 years of the 19th century toward the classical literature of England and Germany. Prior to that epoch, the influence of Locke and Bentham had been dominant in philosophical thought within this country. The theory of innate ideas was repudiated, and there existed a pronounced inclination in favor of the utilitarian basis of. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.